Welcome to Warfront Global. And before moving forward, the host pauses for a moment, speaking calmly, almost the way someone would respectfully address an elder who has watched the world change over many decades. If this channel helps you understand global events a little more clearly, then please consider subscribing. Because the purpose here is simple: to explain the forces shaping our world in a thoughtful and careful way. And one more small request: tell us in the comments, where are you watching this video from today? Every country, every city, every perspective adds to the conversation. Now the story begins. On the 12th day of the escalating conflict in West Asia, the tone of the war began to shift. Until that moment, the world had been watching a familiar pattern of modern conflict. Military briefings were released daily, reports of airstrikes and retaliatory attacks filled international news cycles. Governments issued statements while analysts attempted to predict what might happen next. But wars often reach a moment when the language suddenly changes. Instead of missiles and military movements, the conversation begins to revolve around conditions and negotiations. That moment arrived when Iranian officials publicly announced 3 demands that they say could bring the war to an end. At first glance, the statement appeared simple: 3 conditions, 3 requests, 3 steps that Tehran believes could stop the fighting. Yet beneath that simple announcement lies a deeper strategic message. Because in geopolitics, demands are rarely just demands. They are signals. Signals about how a country views the conflict, what it believes it has gained, and what it believes must be secured before peace becomes possible. For entrepreneurs and business leaders observing events from outside the region, such developments may appear distant. But history shows that conflicts in this region rarely remain isolated. The Middle East sits at the center of the global energy system, and the global energy system sits at the center of the modern economy. Just a short distance from the heart of the conflict lies one of the most important waterways on Earth, the Strait of Hormuz. Through this narrow corridor passes nearly 1/5 of the world's oil supply every day. When instability threatens this region, the consequences quickly spread across global markets. Energy prices react, shipping insurance rises, financial markets begin to adjust expectations almost immediately. This is why analysts often describe Middle Eastern conflicts not simply as regional wars, but as global economic events. And when Iran announced its 3 demands, it was not speaking only to Washington or Tel Aviv. It was sending a message to the entire international system. 3 demands, 3 signals, 3 signals. And now the world is watching closely, waiting to see how the next move will unfold. The first demand: the nuclear question. The first demand presented by Iran immediately returned the conversation to one of the most debated issues in modern geopolitics: the question of nuclear enrichment. For more than 2 decades, Iran's nuclear program has remained at the center of tension between Tehran and several Western governments. Negotiations, sanctions, diplomatic agreements, and military threats have all revolved around this single issue. Now, in the middle of an active war, Iran has once again placed the same question at the center of its conditions for peace. Iran's leadership argues that its nuclear program is entirely legal under international law. They point specifically to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, commonly known as the NPT. Under this treaty, countries that do not possess nuclear weapons agree not to develop them. In return, they maintain the right to pursue nuclear technology for peaceful purposes, including energy production and scientific research. Iran has been a signatory to this treaty for many years. From Tehran's perspective, this means the country has the legal authority to enrich uranium for civilian use. Iranian officials argue that nuclear power is essential for the nation's long-term energy security and technological development. However, the issue becomes complicated when enrichment technology is involved. Uranium enrichment is a process that increases the concentration of a specific uranium isotope used in nuclear reactors. The same process, if pushed to much higher levels, can also produce materials suitable for nuclear weapons. This dual-use nature of enrichment technology has created deep mistrust between Iran and Western governments. The United States and several European countries argue that enrichment capability could eventually allow Iran to move closer to developing nuclear weapons. Israel has been particularly vocal about this concern. Israeli leaders have repeatedly stated that they view a nuclear-capable Iran as a direct threat to their national security. Because of this fear, sanctions were imposed on Iran for many years. These sanctions targeted Iran's banking system, oil exports, and international trade relationships. The economic pressure was designed to slow Iran's nuclear development and push the country back toward negotiations. For a time, diplomacy appeared to make progress. International agreements were reached that limited Iran's enrichment levels and allowed inspectors to monitor its nuclear facilities. Yet those agreements eventually collapsed as political tensions rose again between Iran and Western governments. Now the issue has returned with even greater urgency. By placing nuclear recognition as the first demand for ending the war, Iran is signaling that this issue remains non-negotiable from its perspective. Tehran is not simply asking for a temporary ceasefire. It is asking for formal acknowledgement of its technological rights. For the global business community, this demand carries significant economic implications. If Iran's nuclear program were officially recognized and sanctions were gradually lifted, the country could re-enter global energy markets at a much larger scale. Iran possesses some of the largest oil and natural gas reserves in the world. Greater access to international markets could increase global energy supply and potentially stabilize prices in the long term. At the same time, recognition of Iran's nuclear capabilities would alter the strategic balance across the Middle East. Other countries in the region might pursue similar technologies in response. Such developments could trigger a new wave of nuclear competition in one of the world's most volatile regions. This is why the first demand is so difficult to resolve. It is not simply a technical disagreement about uranium enrichment. It is a question about power, security, and the future structure of the region. And while governments debate these issues, financial markets quietly watch every development, because decisions made about nuclear policy today may influence energy prices, trade relationships, and geopolitical stability for many years ahead. With the nuclear question placed firmly on the table, attention now shifts to Iran's second demand, a demand that moves the conflict from strategic power to financial accountability. The second demand, the cost of war. The second demand presented by Iran moves the conversation away from nuclear technology and into a different arena entirely, the economic consequences of war. According to Iranian officials, the past days of conflict have caused significant damage across several parts of the country. Residential buildings, infrastructure, and civilian facilities have reportedly been affected during the military exchanges. Iran's representatives claim that hundreds of civilians have lost their lives, and that many communities have experienced destruction that will take years to rebuild. Because of this, Tehran has introduced a second condition for ending the war. It is demanding financial reparations. Reparations, in the language of international relations, refer to compensation paid by one country to another for damage caused during conflict. Historically, such payments have followed the end of major wars. After large-scale conflicts, defeated nations have sometimes been required to compensate the affected country for reconstruction and economic losses. However, there is something unusual about Iran's request. This demand has been introduced while the conflict is still ongoing. By placing reparations on the negotiating table at this stage, Iran appears to be shifting the narrative of the conflict. Rather than presenting the war purely as a military confrontation, Tehran is framing it as a matter of legal responsibility and economic accountability. This approach carries important strategic implications. If the issue of reparations enters international discussions, the conflict may gradually move toward diplomatic forums, international courts, and multilateral negotiations. In other words, the battlefield could expand beyond missiles and aircraft into the domain of law and finance. For the global business community, this shift matters. Wars that transform into legal disputes between states often create long periods of uncertainty. Infrastructure reconstruction becomes tied to political agreements. Investment decisions are delayed while governments argue over responsibility and compensation. Energy companies, logistics firms, and infrastructure investors all watch such developments carefully. Because in regions where political disputes remain unresolved, capital tends to wait on the sidelines. There is also another dimension to this demand. By emphasizing civilian losses and infrastructure damage, Iran is attempting to strengthen its diplomatic position within the international community. If Tehran can persuade other countries that it has suffered disproportionate damage, it may gain sympathy in diplomatic forums and potentially build broader support for its demands. Whether that strategy succeeds remains uncertain. The United States and Israel have not indicated any willingness to discuss reparations at this stage. Yet by placing the demand on record, Iran has already introduced a new layer of complexity into the conflict. The war is no longer defined only by missiles and military operations. It now includes a financial argument about who should bear the cost of destruction. And as history repeatedly shows, financial disputes between nations can sometimes last much longer than the wars that created them. With the issue of reparations now part of the discussion, attention turns to Iran's third and final condition, a demand that looks not at the past or the present, but at the future security of the region itself. The third demand, guarantees for the future. The third and final demand presented by Iran moves beyond the immediate battlefield and into the long-term structure of regional security. Unlike the first two demands, which focus on nuclear rights and financial compensation, this condition addresses a deeper question: how future conflicts can be prevented. Iran is asking for binding international guarantees that it will not face similar military attacks again. At first glance, the request may appear straightforward. Countries often seek assurances that hostilities will not resume after conflict ends. Yet in practice, such guarantees are extremely difficult to create. International guarantees require more than promises. They require enforcement mechanisms, diplomatic frameworks, and often the involvement of powerful states willing to uphold those commitments. Without these elements, security assurances can quickly become symbolic rather than practical. History offers many examples where ceasefires were signed, only to collapse months or years later when political tensions resurfaced. Iran's leadership appears determined to avoid that outcome. By demanding binding guarantees now, Tehran is attempting to transform the end of this war into something more permanent, a redefinition of the security environment in the region. This demand also reflects the long memory of Middle Eastern geopolitics. Over the past several decades, the region has experienced multiple cycles of confrontation, temporary ceasefires, and renewed conflict. For Iran, the concern is that even if the current war ends, the underlying tensions could easily reignite in the future. Therefore, the leadership in Tehran is asking for commitments that go beyond simple diplomatic statements. They want formal international assurances that future military strikes will not occur. But such assurances immediately raise another question. Who would provide them? In the complex balance of global power, security guarantees usually involve major international actors. Countries such as Russia, China, or influential regional powers could theoretically participate in a diplomatic framework designed to stabilize the situation. However, bringing multiple powers into a security arrangement also changes the geopolitical landscape. It can reshape alliances, alter strategic partnerships, and redefine how power is distributed across the region. For the global economy, these developments matter greatly. Long-term stability in the Middle East affects energy markets, shipping routes, and investment decisions across several continents. When investors evaluate geopolitical risks, they look not only at present conflicts, but also at the structures that determine whether future conflicts are likely. If credible security guarantees were created, the region could gradually move toward greater stability. Energy infrastructure projects might resume. Trade routes could operate with fewer disruptions. Insurance costs for shipping and logistics could decline. But if the demand for guarantees is rejected or ignored, the opposite scenario becomes possible. The absence of a stable security framework could leave the region vulnerable to repeated cycles of confrontation. In that environment, economic uncertainty tends to persist for years. 3 demands have now been placed on the table: recognition of nuclear rights, financial compensation for wartime damage, and binding guarantees against future attacks. Each demand addresses a different dimension of the conflict: technology, economics, and security. Yet the most important question still remains unanswered. How will the United States and Israel respond? Because in international politics, the response to a demand often determines whether negotiations begin or whether the conflict continues along a far more dangerous path.